Today we have with us Ed Waitzer, who was the author of an article titled Defeating Short-Termism, Why Pension Funds Must Lead. Ed, you write, you start the article by talking about the global financial crisis and how that's causing us to rethink corporate governance. Could you elaborate on that?
Well, I think one of the many lessons from the current crisis is, when you take it to its essence, is really looking at incentives that market and public sector actors had to put the system at risk. In the case of market actors, I guess implicitly assuming that if something went wrong, they would be bailed out. In a sense, that's a metaphor for a much broader set of governance challenges that we face today in terms of the implications of that, the interconnectedness of events, the unpredictability of when a crisis will occur, and the perverse incentives that cause people to think shorter term and not worry about the consequences.
Now, you assert in the article that if we're going to create change, that pension funds is the right group, the right element to cause that change. Why do you say that?
Yeah, my focus is really on the larger, and in particular the public sector pension plans. But there are some conflicts of interest embedded within private sector plans that we could have another discussion about. But when we think of the larger public sector plans, A, their size, and B, the need for them to take a broader, longer term view simply because of the nature of their mandate and obligations, makes it pretty much imperative for them to focus on systemic issues and gives them the ability to exert tremendous influence over a period of time.
So let's get practical then. Give us some examples of the kind of things that you think pension funds could actually do to cause this change.
Well, I think the first thing that they have to do is get their own house in order. As I say in the article, people who live in glass houses should be careful to answer the doorbell. And getting their own house in order, in this case, I think means re-examining the norms by which they are governed, and we refer to those as fiduciary norms or fiduciary duties. There are concepts within trust law which governs these plans. For example, a duty of impartiality. Well, we need to think harder about how those who govern pension plans balance the interests, balance intergenerational interests. How do we balance the interests of current beneficiaries against those into the future? How do we allow for delegation, which is necessary just because of the complexity of managing fund assets, without delegation of responsibility leading to abdication of responsibility or being used simply as a way to insulate decision makers from potential liability. There are a whole sort of, the duty of attentiveness, the duty to do no harm. There are a series of duties that need to be re-examined in light of the new reality, the new normal. I guess the second big issue would be for those who manage or have governance responsibility for large public pension plans to re-examine incentives all the way through their own supply chain. The financial services sector is unique in any sector I know of, insofar as agents almost always do better than principals. It's sort of, the system is turned on its head. So there's a lot of work to be done just examining the whole supply chain and making sure that incentives are aligned in favor of the beneficiaries who are the pension plan participants.
So let's focus in specifically then on how we may rethink the relationship between pension funds as investors and the corporations that they invest in. Should we rethink this relationship of how pension funds should behave as investors?
Yeah. Again, when we're talking about the large public plans that essentially own a piece of everything and are going to own it for the long term, the starting point is that they need to start thinking systemically rather than worrying about whether they're underperforming or outperforming monthly or quarterly or annual benchmarks, or picking the right stock. Their focus needs to be on, are markets sustainable over the long term? They need to focus on real performance rather than on short-term results. I think that leads to a bunch of things. Number one, I think it leads to new forms of engagement between owners, or the representatives of the ultimate owners, and corporate management and corporate boards. It'll lead to new kinds of reporting, because if you're thinking longer term, you need different kind of information. The information you need isn't simply an output, something that kind of management prepares and delivers to the owners. It needs to be a process, and a process that enables corporate management as well as fund managers to think more carefully about risks within the business. I think it will also lead to collective action on the part of the funds, and we're beginning to see that in terms of what's called shareholder activism, but I suspect that will step up. So for example, in Sweden, you now have major long-term shareholders collectively have an entitlement to nominate directors to the board. And basically we're saying, instead of the directors nominating themselves, which is the self-perpetuating process that we have embedded in corporate governance today, let's let a group of stakeholders, and a group of stakeholders who have a long-term interest, assume that responsibility, and by implication also assume a responsibility for monitoring the effectiveness and performance of boards. In South Africa, boards now have social and ethics committees with advisory groups that are appointed by various stakeholders to make sure that the board is focusing on longer term issues and on sustainability of the enterprise. So those are the kinds of engagements that I think forms of engagement that I think will emerge.
Final question. What does all this imply for the kind of boards that pension funds themselves need? And the related question would be, do they have those kinds of boards? Do they have the capacity to do the kind of things or oversee the kind of things that you're suggesting?
You're the right person to ask that question, since you've designed some of the better governance models. And again, the answer has to be, the best way to lead is by example. So if these plans are going to have any credibility and any leverage in changing the system in fundamental ways, they've got to demonstrate by example. And I think the biggest challenge, and one that you've grappled with in designing governance models for some of these large funds, is we've reached a stage in governance generally, where purpose and process seem to have been divorced, and we've got to refocus on the purpose part. We're very process heavy. So I think plan governance has to refocus on competencies, on the amount of time that's being committed, on how those who have governance responsibilities can make a real difference in making sure that there's integrity in the institution.
So Ed, thank you for this conversation. You've set some very big challenges for both pension funds and their boards, and I hope that they're up to the challenge.
Pleasure.